The year was 1944, and Europe was burning. Not the grand, poetic sort of burning sung about in old ballads, not the kind that carried a sense of tragic beauty, but the suffocating kind that clung to your lungs and stung your eyes until you felt half-drowned in smoke. This was a fire that did not dance or flicker. It crawled through the streets, devouring everything it touched, leaving nothing but scorched bone and silent stone behind. War had a way of stealing color from the world. The greens of summer fields, the reds of tiled rooftops, the blues of clear skies, all bled away, replaced by a palette of misery. In the end, everything was painted in the black of burnt timber or the endless gray of falling ash. It was as if the very air had grown tired of light. Lieutenant Edward Eddie Whitmore stood at the edge of a road that had once been the heart of a French village. Now it was a scar. His breath came out in pale clouds, each one snatched away by the cold morning wind. He studied the broken buildings around him, skeletal remains of homes, shop fronts hollowed out, the church's bell tower a jagged stump against the sky. The name of the village no longer mattered. It wasn't on his map anymore. It had been erased as neatly as chalk from a blackboard, not just from paper, but from life itself. Whatever identity it had once possessed had gone up in flames along with its people. The school stood roofless. The church's altar was a heap of charred beams. The cobblestones beneath his boots were littered with glass and splinters, as though the very ground had been shattered. His platoon had arrived after the bombing, marching in on orders to secure the road to the north, a road the retreating Germans might still use. But there was nothing here to conquer. The battle had already passed through like a winter storm, and what it left behind wasn't a victory or even a defeat. It was a graveyard without headstones. From somewhere deeper in the ruins came the soft crunch of boots. Private Thomas "Tommy" Briggs emerged, his face pale beneath the smear of soot across his cheek. At just 19, Tommy was the youngest in the platoon, and though the war had begun to carve its marks into him, in the set of his shoulders, in the way he gripped his rifle too tightly, there was still a boy under the uniform. He came to a stop beside Eddie, his gaze fixed on the twisted remains of a bicycle half buried in rubble. The paint on its frame was blistered black, one wheel missing entirely. Tommy gave it a small kick, as though half expecting it to spring back to life and ride away. The clang of metal echoed through the street, too loud in the stillness. "Sir," he said after a long pause, his voice shaking just enough to betray the thoughts behind it. "How do you fight a war where the enemy's already gone, but the damage stays?" Eddie glanced at him, then looked away again, scanning the skeletal buildings for any sign of movement. The question hung between them like a piece of shrapnel, suspended in the air. How do you answer something like that? You couldn't. Not honestly. War wasn't a puzzle you solved by the end of the day, with neat answers written in the margins. It was more like an illness, a fever that burned through nations until nothing healthy was left, only weakness and scars. You endured it if you could. You survived it if you were lucky. And if you were very unlucky, you became part of its aftermath, another shadow among many. Eddie didn't speak, because the truth was heavier than anything he could put into words. The enemy might be gone from this place, but their absence didn't make it safe. It didn't bring back the dead. It didn't undo the smell of burnt wood and something worse lingering in the air. Somewhere, far off, artillery thumped, not close enough to be a danger yet, but close enough to remind them that this was no end, only a pause. The wind shifted, carrying with it the faint sound of a church bell from another village, one still standing. Eddie wondered how long it would last before the war came for it too. Tommy shifted his weight, his rifle strap creaking. He was still waiting for an answer, but Eddie only gave him a nod, a silent acknowledgement that the question was understood, even if the answer didn't exist. They turned and walked on, their boots crunching over broken glass. Each step felt louder than the last, as if the ground itself resented being disturbed. And all around them, the village remained still. Not the stillness of peace, but the brittle quiet of a place that had run out of things to lose. Eddie didn't need to say it out loud. In war, some wounds were permanent, and some enemies left behind more than just their dead. By the time the sun had climbed to its highest, What remained of the platoon had taken shelter in the least damaged building they could find, a bakery. Or rather, what had once been a bakery. The walls still stood, though cracked and blackened in places, but the roof had collapsed inward, letting in a pale winter light that caught motes of ash drifting in the air. The smell lingered, not the pleasant, yeasty warmth of fresh bread, but the bitter sting of scorched flour, damp plaster, and charred timber. Somewhere in that mix was another scent, heavier and darker, that no one spoke about. The men huddled around a small fire built from the remains of a splintered counter. They spoke little, their words short and utilitarian, each man wrapped in his own silence. Eddie crouched near the wall, rubbing his hands together against the cold. It was then that movement caught his eye. A slight figure stood in the doorway, half in shadow. She couldn't have been more than 12 years old. Her coat was torn, hanging crookedly from her shoulders, and her hair was tangled and dull with soot. In her arms she clutched a bundle wrapped in thin cloth, holding it as though it contained her whole world. She stepped forward, eyes darting from one soldier to the next. Then she began speaking rapidly in French, her voice urgent, almost pleading. Eddie caught fragments. Frère, bless, sous la maison. Her brother. Hurt. Trapped in the cellar of their house, somewhere at the far edge of the village. Eddie straightened, frowning. He'd heard enough French to piece it together, but before he could reply, the scrape of a chair came from the far corner. Captain Arthur Hensley, their commanding officer, rose from where he had been leaning over a map spread across an upturned crate. He was a broad man, his face weathered and shadowed by stubble, his uniform still neatly kept despite the ruin around them. His eyes, when he looked at the girl, were cool and unyielding. "We're not here for civilians," he said flatly, his voice carrying over the crackle of the fire. "We have a road to secure." Eddie turned to him. "Sir, she says her brother's trapped. He could die down there." Hensley's gaze didn't waver. "That's not our mission, Whitmore. The road is the priority. Every minute we waste here puts the whole operation at risk." Eddie's jaw tightened. "Sir, the road will still be there in an hour." Something cold flickered in Hensley's eyes. He stepped closer, his boots crunching over debris. "That's an order, Lieutenant. Ignore the girl." The words hung in the air, sharp and heavy. Eddie glanced back at the child. She didn't understand English, that much was obvious, but she understood tone. Her wide, dark eyes seemed to drink in every gesture, every shift in posture, as if she could read the unspoken battle between the two men. She hugged the bundle in her arms tighter, knuckles white against the cloth. Eddie felt the weight of it, the weight of two wars. One was drawn in straight lines on a map, measured in objectives and supply routes. The other was fought silently, inside the people who had to live with the consequences of those lines. Around them, the men of the platoon shifted uncomfortably, some looking away, others glancing from Hensley to Eddie. No one spoke. The fire popped and hissed, sending a small spray of sparks into the air. Outside, the wind howled through the empty street, carrying with it the faint groan of a building settling into ruin. Hensley turned back to his map, signaling the discussion was over. The scrape of his pencil against paper filled the space where an answer should have been. But Eddie didn't move. His eyes stayed on the girl. She met his gaze without flinching, as though she already knew the decision he was wrestling with. And Eddie, in that moment, realized the truth. Orders could be obeyed, but some of them left scars you never saw until years later. That night, when the bitter wind had settled into the ruins and the rest of the platoon lay bundled in their blankets, Eddie eased himself to his feet. The low murmur of sleeping men and the occasional hiss of the fire masked his movements. He glanced once toward Captain Hensley, a solid silhouette against the faint glow of the embers, then stepped out into the darkness. The cold hit him like a wall, sharp and unwelcoming. The streets were ghostly in the moonlight, silver light spilling across collapsed roofs and splintered beams. In the shadows near the bakery, the girl was waiting, as if she had known he would come. She stepped forward without a word, her eyes catching the dim light, then turned and led the way. They moved quickly, boots crunching over frost, and the brittle remains of glass. The air was so still that every sound seemed magnified. The creak of Eddie's webbing, the soft scuff of the girl's shoes, the occasional distant groan of a collapsing wall. No dog barked, no voice called. The village was long past such things. At the very edge of the settlement, the girl stopped. Her house stood there, leaning as though a great hand had shoved it from the side. The upper floor sagged dangerously, and the walls were blackened by fire. Eddie followed her inside. The interior smelled of damp ash and stale air. Furniture lay overturned, and in the corner, what might once have been a kitchen table was reduced to a heap of char and splinters. She pointed toward the back, where a trapdoor was barely visible under a tangle of collapsed beams. He dropped to his knees, tugging at the wood. His gloves snagged and tore against jagged edges. The beams were heavier than they looked, and each one had to be shifted carefully to avoid bringing more of the ceiling down. His breath steamed in the cold air, coming faster with every pull. When the trapdoor finally came free, a wave of stale, earthy air rolled out, laced with the metallic tang of blood, the acrid bite of smoke, and something older, like soil long undisturbed until war had forced it to remember death. He descended into the cellar, the girl close behind. In the gloom, a boy lay sprawled on the dirt floor, no more than 16. His skin was pale, almost gray in the weak light, and his leg was twisted at an unnatural angle. His eyes fluttered open. "Vous êtes pas allemand?" he whispered, his voice thin. Eddie shook his head.
No.
Not German. He crouched and slid his arms beneath the boy, feeling the sharp lightness of a frame that had known hunger for too long. The boy gave a faint gasp of pain, but did not cry out. Eddie carried him up into the cold night, the girl trailing close, her small hands gripping the back of his greatcoat, as though letting go might make the moment vanish. When Eddie stepped back into the gutted bakery with the girl and her injured brother, the air inside felt colder than the night outside. Captain Hensley was there, standing rigid near the smoldering fire, his cap pulled low, his eyes shadowed. The expression on his face was not relief. It was fury, a cold, controlled fury that seemed more dangerous than shouting. His jaw worked for a moment before the words came, sharp as bayonet steel. "You disobeyed a direct order, Whitmore," he said, his voice low but carrying through the room. "Do you have the faintest idea what that means in wartime?" Eddie set the boy down gently on a folded blanket one of the men had pulled from their kit. He straightened slowly, turning to meet Hensley's glare. His breath was still heavy from the effort of carrying the boy, his gloves torn and streaked with soot. "It means," Eddie said evenly, "that I didn't leave a kid to die in a hole." There was no tremor in his voice, but the silence in the room deepened. Men shifted in their places around the fire, the crackle of the flames suddenly loud in the stillness. Hensley took a step forward, his boots grinding on broken plaster. "You risked the entire platoon's safety for." He never finished. The world outside gave a sudden, terrible cough, the kind that only heavy artillery can make. A shell slammed into the street 2 blocks away, the explosion tearing through the frozen air with a deafening roar. The ground lurched under their feet. Dust and ash shook loose from the fractured beams above, sifting down in a choking cloud. The bakery's walls groaned, one of them shedding a brick with a dull, final thud. Somewhere to their right, a man screamed, raw and high, the kind of sound that made your gut twist. Eddie didn't move. His eyes stayed on Hensley, though his pulse hammered in his ears. The captain's expression shifted, just slightly. The fury didn't fade, but it was no longer the only thing in his face. There was something else now, the quick, calculating awareness of a man who knew the enemy was close again. Outside, another shell whined overhead, landing farther away this time. Somewhere in the distance, machine guns stuttered like angry typewriters. Neither man spoke. There was nothing left to say. The war itself had decided to answer for them, drowning out argument with the blunt reminder that orders, disobedience, right and wrong all meant the same thing when the shells started falling. Survive if you can. The next morning broke under a sky the color of lead. The cold was sharper, biting through greatcoats and gloves as though the fabric wasn't there at all. The men moved stiffly, stamping their feet to keep the blood flowing while they waited for word. When it came, it wasn't good. Intelligence reported that the German retreat wasn't as far as they had believed. The enemy had pulled back only enough to regroup, and now they were gathering for another push. The road, the same one Eddie had argued about just the day before, had to be held until reinforcements arrived. No matter the cost. By mid-morning, the first attack came. Dark shapes emerged through the drifting mist, rifles flashing in the pale light. Eddie's platoon opened fire, the crack of Enfields and the hammering rattle of the Bren gun shattering the silence. The Germans fell back after a fierce exchange, but the ground was already soaked in more than just thawing frost. And so it went. For 48 hours, they fought in freezing mud, the battlefield a churn of ice, blood, and shrapnel. There was no rest, only brief lulls when the enemy pulled back far enough to regroup. Then the shadows would appear again, faces half hidden under helmets, eyes glinting with the same exhaustion Eddie saw in his own men. The worst of it was how young they all were on both sides. The enemy soldiers charging through the fog looked just as cold, just as tired, and just as far from home as the men defending the road. War didn't care how young you were, it simply swallowed you whole. On the second night, the air was thick with smoke and frost, every breath a struggle. Eddie was crouched in a shallow trench beside Tommy Briggs, the youngest in the platoon. Tommy's rifle barrel steamed faintly each time he fired, his lips moving soundlessly, maybe counting shots, maybe whispering something only he could hear. Then it happened. A sharp crack, a brief gasp, and Tommy slumped sideways, hit square in the chest. Eddie caught him before he hit the mud, pulling him close. The boy's eyes were wide, his breath shallow. His hand, smeared with blood, clutched at Eddie's sleeve with desperate strength, as if holding him there might somehow hold back death itself. Eddie pressed his hand over the wound, but the warmth was already leaving. Tommy's grip slackened, his eyes fixed on something far beyond the smoke and the gunfire. And then he was gone. By the time the reinforcements finally came, the road was still in Allied hands, but it was a victory written in blood. Half the platoon was gone, and the survivors were left staring at the churned, frozen earth, wondering if holding a strip of ground had been worth the price they'd paid. When the war finally ended months later, Eddie returned to the village. The bakery was gone now, the rubble cleared. Elise was there, older somehow, though only a year had passed. Her brother walked with a limp but was alive. They didn't need to say much. Sometimes survival itself is the only conversation you need. Elise handed him a small loaf of bread, still warm.
"Pour vous," she said.
"For you." Eddie took it, knowing it was more than bread. It was a piece of a promise, that even in war, someone could choose to save instead of destroy. Years later, Eddie would tell his children about the war, but never about the medals or the battles. He would tell them about a burnt bakery, a girl in torn clothes, and a choice that mattered more than any victory. Because in the end, history remembers wars by their dates. But people remember them by the lives they saved or failed to.